In the Valley Ledgers of Breathitt County, Kentucky, Clara Hewitt's name appears beside 63 births between 1885 and 1908. 37 of those entries list no father. The ink in those blank spaces is darker than the rest, as if someone pressed harder when writing nothing at all. Was Clara protecting families or protecting something far worse? Before we dive into the story, what's the darkest case you've ever heard or experienced? Write it in the comments. Let's compare notes. Also, tell us where you're watching from today and what time is it right now. We're building a community of truth seekers who aren't afraid of the dark. Now, let's continue with the story. Clara Hewitt's hands had delivered more babies in Pike Hollow than any doctor who'd ever attempted the mountain roads. By the winter of 1907, she had been the primary midwife for the Hollow and 3 neighboring valleys for 23 years. The Breathitt County Clerk's office held records of 63 births attributed to her work, though local families insisted the true number was closer to 90. The difference existed because Clara understood something the county officials did not. Some births needed to remain off the official record entirely. She lived in a cabin 2 miles up Kettle Creek, accessible only by a trail that turned impassable during heavy rain. The location was strategic. Women could reach her without being seen from the main road, and Clara could turn away visitors she didn't trust simply by claiming the creek was too high to cross safely. Her isolation was both chosen and necessary for the role she played in the community. The work itself required skills beyond medical knowledge. Clara knew how to read the weather well enough to predict if she'd make it to a laboring woman before the child arrived. She could identify complications by touch alone, having learned from experience what a breech presentation felt like through a woman's belly and how to turn a baby before it became a death sentence for both mother and child. She kept a leather bag packed with clean linens, scissors she boiled after every use, and herbs she'd learned to use from her own mother, who had been a midwife before her. But the real skill, the one that made Clara trusted above any outsider doctor, was her absolute silence about what she witnessed. In a region where family reputation determined access to credit, employment, and marriage prospects, illegitimate pregnancy could destroy multiple generations. A girl who bore a child without a husband's name attached risked being cast out entirely, which in practical terms meant starvation or prostitution in the lumber camps. Her family faced social exile that could extend to siblings who needed to marry and parents who needed community support in their old age. Clara's discretion made survival possible. She delivered babies in the middle of the night and left before dawn, accepting payment in preserved food or firewood rather than cash that might create a record. She never asked questions about paternity and gave no indication through facial expression or later conversation that she'd noticed anything unusual. Women trusted her because she'd proven over decades that their secrets died with her, or at least stayed locked behind her silence. The county records revealed the pattern. Starting in 1885, births began appearing in the official ledgers with increasingly creative explanations for missing fathers. Some listed men as deceased without providing death certificates. Others claimed the father had left the region for work and provided names that matched no census records anywhere in Kentucky. A few simply left the space blank, letting the ink speak its own form of protection. Census data told a more complicated story. Children appeared in household listings who had never been registered with the county clerk at all. Families counted 6 children in the 1890 census, but had only filed birth records for 4. The gaps clustered around Clara's known territory, suggesting she'd helped arrange for certain births to bypass official documentation entirely. This wasn't illegal in any prosecutable sense. Remote mountain communities operated with such limited government oversight that record-keeping remained largely voluntary. As long as births and deaths stayed within expected patterns, nobody from the county seat questioned the details. Clara's work existed in the space between what the law required and what the mountains allowed. The families protected her in return. When a state health inspector arrived in 1903 asking questions about maternal mortality rates, every family he interviewed praised Clara's skill while providing completely contradictory information about how many babies she'd delivered and for whom. The inspector left with numbers that made no mathematical sense, convinced only that mountain people were impossible to survey accurately. Clara's authority extended beyond the birthing room. She could declare a child too weak to survive and spare a family from raising a severely disabled infant in an environment with no medical resources. She could recognize when a young mother was still a child herself and quietly arrange for grandparents to take over. She could identify signs of violence on a woman's body and choose whether that information stayed private or became a community matter. The community depended on this system functioning exactly as it had for generations. Clara maintained order through selective silence, protecting reputations, while enabling families to survive circumstances that the outside world would judge harshly but couldn't fix. By 1907, no one questioned Clara's judgment anymore. Her word carried more weight than any doctor's diagnosis or legal document. She'd earned absolute trust through decades of proven discretion. That trust was about to be tested in ways no one expected. The girl arrived at Clara's cabin on a January afternoon in 1908, alone and shaking from more than just the cold. She appeared approximately 16 or 17 years old, though malnutrition could have made her look younger than her actual age. What caught Clara's attention immediately was not the advanced pregnancy, which she'd seen countless times before, but the way the girl kept her eyes fixed on the ground and flinched at every sound from the surrounding woods. In 23 years of midwifery, Clara had learned to distinguish between the normal anxiety of an unwed mother and the specific terror of someone who believed she was being hunted. The girl refused to give her full name, offering only Ruth. She carried nothing except a cloth bag containing one change of clothes and a small amount of money wrapped in a handkerchief. When Clara asked who knew she'd come here, Ruth's response was immediate and panicked. Nobody could know, or nobody could ever know. This level of secrecy wasn't unusual in itself. Clara had delivered babies for girls who'd traveled from 3 counties away, specifically because their own communities were too small to keep secrets. What made Ruth different was her refusal to name the father, even in private conversation with Clara alone. Most young women in her situation would confide in the midwife, seeking advice or help arranging future contact. Ruth acted as though speaking the name aloud would summon something dangerous. Clara provided the standard care she offered all women who sought her help. She examined Ruth to determine how far along the pregnancy had progressed, estimating approximately 7 months. The physical examination revealed signs that concerned her beyond typical pregnancy complications. The girl showed evidence of prolonged stress and inadequate nutrition. She had bruising in various stages of healing along her arms and ribs, patterns that could indicate falls or could indicate something more deliberate. When Clara asked about the bruises, Ruth claimed she'd fallen multiple times while working in her family's garden. The explanation was plausible enough. Mountain farms were dangerous places, and pregnant women did lose their balance more easily. But the bruises' locations and the girl's reaction when Clara touched certain areas suggested defensive injuries rather than simple accidents. Ruth stayed in Clara's cabin for the remaining weeks of her pregnancy. During that time, she rarely spoke beyond necessary communication about her physical needs. She refused to go outside even briefly, claiming the cold hurt her lungs. At night, she darted awake at sounds that Clara couldn't hear, sitting upright with her heart racing until she remembered where she was. The behavior suggested severe trauma, though its exact nature remained unclear. Some possibilities seemed more likely than others. Rural isolation created opportunities for abuse within families that would have been noticed and stopped in more populated areas. Economic desperation forced young women into situations where they had no power to refuse or escape. The combination of poverty, isolation, and limited legal protection for women created conditions where exploitation could occur without consequence. Historical records from this period document similar cases across Appalachia. Court documents from surrounding counties mention occasional prosecutions for what was termed criminal assault involving young women, though convictions remained rare. The legal system required victims to prove force had been used, an impossible standard when the accused held economic or social power over the accuser. Most cases never reached court at all, handled instead through private family arrangements or simply ignored. Clara observed that Ruth never mentioned returning home or making plans for after the birth. When asked directly what she intended to do with the child, Ruth's answer revealed the depth of her desperation. She said she didn't know if they'd both survive the birth, and maybe that would be better. Anyway, Clara had heard similar statements from women experiencing severe depression, but Ruth's tone suggested she was considering specific actions rather than expressing general hopelessness. The midwife increased her supervision, ensuring Ruth was never alone for extended periods. She prepared for the possibility that intervention might be needed beyond standard medical care. Her experience had taught her that some situations required community involvement rather than professional silence. During the final week before Ruth went into labor, she had one conversation that Clara would remember decades later. Ruth asked whether Clara had ever delivered a baby that looked exactly like its father, so much that paternity was impossible to deny. Clara confirmed this happened frequently, explaining that some children bore such strong resemblance to their fathers from birth that family members would comment on it immediately. Ruth's response was quiet, but clear. She said that's what she was afraid of, that everyone would know just by looking, that the baby would be proof of something that couldn't be explained away or forgotten. Clara understood then that Ruth wasn't afraid of community judgment about illegitimacy. She was afraid of what the child's appearance might reveal about its conception. The fear suggested that whoever the father was, his identity carried implications beyond simple scandal. The historical record shows that this type of fear was not unfounded. Children born from situations involving abuse or exploitation by relatives often bore family resemblance that made their origins impossible to hide. In communities where everyone knew everyone else's family features, a child's face could become evidence of crimes that would otherwise remain unprovable. Clara made a decision during those final days before Ruth's labor began. She would pay attention to details that she'd trained herself to ignore in other cases. She would observe what she typically chose not to see, and if necessary, she would speak about things that mountain midwives had kept silent about for generations. The choice would destroy everything she'd built, but Clara was beginning to suspect that some silences caused more harm than the truth ever could. On January 23, 1908, Ruth went into labor 3 weeks earlier than Clara had calculated. The delivery would force Clara to make the decision that would define the rest of her life. Within 72 hours of the birth, Clara Hewitt spoke a name she'd kept silent for decades, and the entire hollow heard it. The labor lasted 14 hours, beginning just after midnight on January 23, 1908. Ruth's delivery presented complications that Clara had seen before, but hoped to avoid in this case. The medical details mattered less than what they revealed about the circumstances surrounding the pregnancy. Clara's training had taught her to recognize signs that distinguished consensual relations from situations where consent was impossible. The child was born healthy despite arriving early, a boy weighing approximately 6 pounds. Ruth held him only briefly before turning away, refusing to look at his face. Clara understood the reaction. Some mothers bonded immediately with their newborns regardless of circumstances, while others needed time to process trauma before they could feel anything beyond survival instinct. What Clara noticed during and immediately after the delivery would determine everything that followed. Medical knowledge in 1908 was limited compared to modern understanding, but experienced midwives developed observational skills that often exceeded what formally trained doctors knew. Clara had delivered enough babies to recognize patterns that indicated specific types of trauma. She observed physical evidence suggesting Ruth had experienced significant force during the pregnancy's conception. The details were medical rather than suitable for general discussion, but they pointed toward assault rather than consensual activity. Combined with Ruth's age, apparent malnutrition, and psychological state, the evidence built a picture that Clara found impossible to ignore. The second observation was more straightforward. The baby bore such strong resemblance to someone Clara knew that paternity seemed undeniable. Infant appearance can be deceiving, and many newborns initially resemble people they're not related to at all. However, certain distinctive family features appear from birth and remain consistent throughout life. This child displayed multiple traits that Clara recognized immediately. She saw the distinctive Tenbrook forehead, a characteristic that ran through 4 generations in Breathitt County. She noticed the specific ear shape that marked every male member of that family. Most tellingly, the baby had the unusual eye spacing and brow line that made Tenbrooks identifiable, even in old photographs where other details were unclear. Virgil Tenbrook owned approximately 3,000 acres of timberland in Pike Hollow and the surrounding valleys. He employed 42 men directly in his lumber operation and controlled credit arrangements for most families in the region through his partnership in the general store. He served on the county board of supervisors and maintained connections to the state legislature through family ties. His economic power meant that challenging him carried consequences beyond social disapproval. Clara spent the first day after the birth caring for Ruth and considering her options. The standard practice would be to say nothing, accept payment, and leave the situation to resolve itself through private family arrangements. She'd followed that protocol successfully for 23 years. But this case violated her sense of what silence protected versus what it enabled. Ruth's age made consent legally questionable, even in an era with minimal protections for young women. The evidence of trauma suggested circumstances beyond seduction or poor judgment. The power imbalance between a wealthy landowner and an apparently poor girl from outside the hollow created conditions where meaningful choice was impossible. Clara also considered the practical implications of speaking. If Ruth tried to name Tenbrook herself, her word would carry no weight against his denial. She had no family present to support her claim, and no resources to pursue any kind of legal action. Without corroboration from a credible witness, her accusation would be dismissed as attention-seeking or an attempt to extort money. Clara's testimony changed the calculation. As a respected midwife with decades of trusted service, her word carried authority that Ruth's could not. If Clara confirmed the girl's claim and added medical evidence from the delivery, the community would have to take the accusation seriously, even if they chose not to act on it. On January 25th, 2 days after the birth, Clara walked down to the valley and spoke to 3 different families in the span of 4 hours. She told them that Virgil Tenbrook was the father of Ruth's child. She stated that medical evidence from the delivery suggested circumstances inconsistent with consensual relations. She explained that the child's appearance provided physical proof that Ruth's claim was accurate. The news spread through Pike Hollow within hours. By evening, it had reached neighboring valleys. By the following morning, everyone in Breathitt County who knew either Clara or Tenbrook had heard some version of the story. The Breathitt County Herald mentioned the situation in its February 2nd edition, though with careful wording that avoided explicit accusations. The brief notice read, "A dispute regarding matters of paternity has arisen in Pike Hollow, concerning a prominent local family, the Hua. Matter remains under private discussion." No names appeared in print, but everyone who read the notice knew exactly what it referenced. Clara's action violated every principle that had made her trusted and successful. Midwives maintained their position through absolute discretion. They were confessors, who never spoke confessions aloud, and witnesses who testified to nothing. The entire social structure of mountain communities depended on certain things remaining private, handled within families, or not handled at all. By naming Tenbrook publicly, Clara destroyed the foundation of trust that had supported her work. She demonstrated that her loyalty to truth, or justice, or protection of the vulnerable exceeded her commitment to the silence that made her valuable. The precedent was devastating. If Clara could speak about one case, what prevented her from speaking about others? How many secrets from previous births might she reveal if she decided they warranted disclosure? The community faced a choice between believing a respected midwife who'd never been known to lie and protecting a powerful man whose economic influence affected everyone's survival. The decision would split families, end friendships, and create divisions that would persist for generations. Clara returned to her cabin and waited to see which principle the Hollow valued more: protection of the powerful or accountability for harm. The answer would determine not just her own fate, but whether speaking the truth in Appalachia was possible at all. The Hollow divided along lines that had nothing to do with truth and everything to do with survival. Within a week of Clara's accusation becoming public knowledge, families who had lived as neighbors for 3 generations stopped speaking to each other. The split wasn't random. It followed economic dependencies, family loyalties, and calculations about who held power versus who held moral authority. Every household in Pike Hollow had to make a choice that would define their social and financial future. The Kincaid family spoke in Clara's defense first. Margaret Kincaid had been present when Clara delivered her 3rd child in 1903 and trusted the midwife's judgment completely. Her husband operated a small sawmill independent of Tenbrook's lumber operation, which gave them financial freedom most families lacked. At the February church service, Margaret stood during the community prayer time and stated publicly that Clara Hewitt had more integrity than any person she'd known. And if Clara said something was true, then believing her was the only decent choice. The statement forced others to respond. Families who remained silent would be seen as taking sides through their refusal to speak. The Drummond family, whose eldest son worked directly for Tenbrook as a timber crew foreman, left the service before communion. They never returned to that church. Within 2 weeks, they'd begun attending services in the next valley. A 3-hour journey each direction that they undertook every Sunday, rather than sit in the same building as the Kincaids. Church records from Oak Grove Baptist in Pike Hollow show the exodus clearly. The congregation had maintained stable membership of approximately 60 families since 1895. Between February and April of 1908, 17 families formally transferred their membership to other churches or stopped attending entirely. The session notes from March mention divisions within the congregation regarding private matters, but provide no specifics. By summer, the church had split into 2 separate congregations, meeting in different buildings, though both claimed to be the legitimate continuation of Oak Grove Baptist. The economic consequences appeared just as quickly. Ten Brook's General Store extended credit to most families in the hollow, with debt settled after timber sales or harvest. The store ledger for 1908, preserved in the County Historical Society archives, shows a pattern that speaks louder than any testimony. Families known to support Clara found their credit limits reduced or eliminated entirely. The Kincaids, who had maintained accounts in good standing for 15 years, received notice that they could only make cash purchases going forward. Other families saw opposite treatment. The Drummonds' credit limit increased significantly in March. Families who publicly questioned Clara's judgment or suggested she'd overstepped her authority found themselves with better terms than they'd previously enjoyed. The ledger created a financial record of loyalty that anyone could read. Property transactions told the same story. Deed records from Breathitt County show unusual activity in the spring and summer of 1908. The Hickman family sold their farm to distant relatives and moved to Virginia, despite having lived in Pike Hollow for 4 decades. Their land bordered property owned by the Kincaids, and letters, preserved in family collections, mention that living next to certain people became impossible after the trouble started. 3 other families sold property between March and June, all citing similar vague reasons about needing to relocate for work or health. The pattern suggested they were removing themselves from an environment that had become socially toxic. Staying neutral wasn't possible when every interaction, every transaction, every conversation carried implications about which side you supported. The children felt the division most acutely. School attendance records show that several families withdrew their children from the one-room schoolhouse in Pike Hollow and began teaching them at home. Parents couldn't risk their children playing together or forming friendships that crossed the new social boundaries. A child's casual comment about what they'd heard at home could damage their family's position in the ongoing conflict. Some families tried to maintain neutrality by withdrawing from community life entirely. They stopped attending church, avoided the general store when possible, and limited their interactions to essential business. This strategy failed because silence was interpreted as a position. Refusing to defend Clara was seen as opposition to her. Refusing to condemn her was seen as support. The Hollow's social structure had no space for people who wanted to remain uninvolved. Letters from this period, preserved in various family collections and historical society archives, reveal the personal cost of the division. One woman wrote to her sister in another county, "We cannot visit anymore because your husband spoke for the Hewitt woman, and my husband's employment depends on saying nothing. I miss you terribly, but feeding my children matters more than maintaining our friendship." Another letter, written by a man to his brother, expressed frustration with the impossible choice. "If I say Clara was right, my family loses everything. If I say she was wrong, I cannot live with myself. There is no good answer, only different types of destruction. The Tenbrook family's response to the division was strategic silence. Virgil Tenbrook made no public statements, filed no defamation lawsuit, and offered no formal denial. His economic actions spoke clearly enough. Families who questioned Clara's authority thrived. Families who supported her struggled. The pattern required no explanation. By late spring, Pike Hollow had effectively become two separate communities occupying the same geographic space. People who passed each other on the road sometimes acknowledged the encounter with a brief nod, but often simply looked away. Former friends became strangers. Extended family members stopped gathering for holidays or funerals. The fracture ran so deep that it affected decisions about where to bury the dead. When old Samuel Parrish died in May, his family buried him in the newer cemetery plot rather than the traditional family graveyard, because the traditional plot would have required crossing land owned by people who'd taken the opposite side in the conflict. The community Clara had served for 23 years no longer existed as a unified whole. Her decision to speak had destroyed the social bonds that held the hollow together. Whether that destruction was necessary to expose a greater evil, or whether it caused more harm than the original wrong, remained a question that divided families for generations. The question wasn't whether Clara spoke about what she'd witnessed, but whether anyone would believe observations that couldn't be verified. Clara's detailed account of why she'd named Virgil Tenbrook survives only in fragments, preserved through letters written by people she spoke to in the weeks following the birth. None of these secondhand records provide Clara's exact words, but they outline the substance of her testimony with enough consistency to reconstruct her central claims. According to Margaret, Kincaid's letter to her sister dated February 15, 1908, Clara stated that medical evidence from the delivery indicated circumstances inconsistent with voluntary relations. The letter doesn't specify what that evidence was, only that Clara described it in clinical terms that Margaret found disturbing but credible. Clara reportedly explained that her 23 years of experience had taught her to recognize specific patterns that distinguish different types of situations, and this case fell clearly into the category requiring intervention. A second account appears in the diary of Reverend Thomas Lyle, who served Oak Grove Baptist until the congregation split. His entry from March 2nd mentions a conversation with Clara where she discussed Ruth's physical condition beyond the pregnancy itself. Clara apparently told the Reverend that the young woman showed signs of prolonged nutritional deficiency and injuries, suggesting an extended period of difficult circumstances. The Reverend's notes indicate Clara believed Ruth's situation had persisted for some time before the pregnancy, possibly months or longer. The most detailed secondhand account comes from Dr. Herbert Garrison, a physician who practiced in the county seat and occasionally consulted with midwives on complicated cases. In a letter to a colleague dated April 7th, Garrison describes meeting Clara at the courthouse where she'd gone to inquire about legal options for Ruth. Clara reportedly explained her medical observations in technical language that Garrison found professionally competent despite her lack of formal training. According to Garrison's account, Clara emphasized 3 factors that had convinced her to speak publicly. First, Ruth's age, which Clara estimated at 16 or possibly younger, based on physical development markers that experienced midwives learned to assess. Second, the medical evidence from the delivery itself, which Clara described as indicating force rather than consent. Third, statements Ruth had made during labor when pain reduced her ability to maintain careful silence about her circumstances. This third factor proved most controversial. Women in labor often said things they wouldn't say otherwise, and the reliability of such statements as evidence was questionable at best. Clara acknowledged this limitation, but maintained that Ruth's specific words, combined with the physical evidence and the child's obvious resemblance to Tenbrook, created a pattern too consistent to dismiss. The problem with Clara's testimony was its ultimate unverifiability. No one else had been present during the delivery. The medical evidence she cited required interpretation based on experience that other people didn't possess. Ruth's statements during labor existed only in Clara's memory, with no witnesses to confirm or deny their content or context. Medical knowledge in 1908 provided limited framework for the kind of forensic analysis that modern healthcare workers use to identify assault. Doctors and midwives of the period understood anatomy and could recognize amid obvious physical trauma. But the subtle indicators that Clara claimed to observe fell into areas where professional opinion varied widely. What one practitioner interpreted as evidence of force, another might attribute to normal variation in delivery circumstances. Clara's supporters argued that her experience gave her specialized knowledge that formal medical training couldn't provide. She'd delivered 90 or more babies and had developed observational skills through direct experience. If she said she could distinguish between different types of situations based on medical evidence, her track record of reliable judgment supported trusting her assessment. Her critics countered that experience could also create bias. Perhaps Clara had made assumptions based on Ruth's youth and obvious distress, then interpreted ambiguous medical findings through that pre-existing conclusion. The human mind excels at finding patterns that support beliefs we already hold, and even experienced practitioners can mistake correlation for causation. The debate centered on whether Clara had witnessed objective evidence or had constructed a narrative from incomplete information. Both interpretations fit the available facts. Clara could have observed clear medical indicators that proved her case. Or she could have seen a young, traumatized woman give birth to a child resembling a powerful man, and concluded assault had occurred based on probability rather than proof. Ruth's statements during labor became particularly contested. Clara reported that Ruth had specifically named Tenbrook and described circumstances that made consent impossible. However, pain and exhaustion during delivery could distort memory and perception. Ruth might have said exactly what Clara reported, or Clara might have interpreted fragmentary statements through her own growing conviction about what had happened. The controversy revealed how much of medical practice, especially in rural areas, depended on individual judgment rather than objective standards. Clara's entire career had been built on her ability to assess situations and make decisions based on observation and experience. Her supporters saw no reason to doubt that ability now. Her detractors questioned whether anyone's judgment, no matter how experienced, should carry enough weight to destroy a man's reputation without corroborating evidence. Historical medical journals from this period show that the question of evidentiary standards in cases involving potential assault was actively debated within the profession. Some physicians argued that medical evidence alone could rarely prove assault beyond reasonable doubt, since most physical findings had multiple possible explanations. Others maintained that experienced practitioners could identify patterns that, while not individually conclusive, collectively built a compelling case. Clara's situation highlighted the impossible position of healthcare providers who suspected wrongdoing, but lacked definitive proof. Staying silent protected potentially guilty parties and left vulnerable people without advocates. Speaking publicly risked destroying reputations based on observations that couldn't be independently verified. For Clara, the choice came down to whether her professional judgment deserved the same credibility she'd earned through decades of reliable service. She'd made thousands of medical assessments that people had trusted without question. If her judgment was sound in those cases, why would it suddenly become unreliable in this one? The answer, for many in Pike Hollow, was that this case involved consequences that previous cases hadn't. When Clara's judgment affected only medical care, people trusted her completely. When it threatened to expose powerful people to public accusation, suddenly her experience and observations became insufficient evidence. Clara's testimony survived in fragments because no one recorded it systematically at the time. The Hollow wasn't interested in documenting evidence for future evaluation. They wanted to choose sides and move forward, leaving the question of truth unresolved. The Tenbrook family never denied Clara's accusation, because denial would have given it legitimacy worth refuting. Virgil Tenbrook's response to being publicly named as the father of Ruth's child was strategically perfect. He made no statements to the newspaper, filed no defamation lawsuit, sent no letters to community leaders, and offered no public or private explanation. The complete absence of reaction communicated more effectively than any defense could have. His silence suggested that Clara's accusation was so beneath his dignity that acknowledging it would be degrading. This approach had historical precedent in how wealthy families handled scandal throughout the rural South. Responding to accusations from social inferiors implied those accusations deserved serious consideration. Ignoring them entirely reinforced class boundaries and signaled that the accuser's words carried no weight worth addressing. The strategy worked because it forced the community to choose between believing a midwife's testimony or accepting that powerful families existed above the accountability that governed everyone else. The Tenbrook family withdrew from certain public activities while maintaining their economic presence. They stopped attending church services at Oak Grove Baptist in February, but this didn't represent retreat so much as strategic repositioning. The family began attending services at a larger church in the county seat, where their presence among established wealthy families normalized their status and removed them from the controversy's immediate social environment. Virgil's business operations continued without interruption. The lumber crews worked the same schedules, the sawmill processed the same volume of timber, and the general store maintained its hours and inventory. The family's economic power remained completely intact, even as their social visibility in Pike Hollow decreased. This combination sent a clear message about what truly mattered in determining community standing. The economic consequences for Clara's supporters began appearing in March and accelerated through the spring. The mechanisms were subtle enough to avoid appearing as direct retaliation, but the pattern was unmistakable to anyone paying attention. Men who worked for Tenbrook's lumber operation found their hours reduced if their families had spoken in Clara's defense. The reasons given were always legitimate: seasonal factors affecting timber demand, concerns about worker safety, or restructuring of crew assignments. None of the explanations mentioned the controversy directly. Samuel Kincaid, whose wife Margaret had been Clara's most vocal defender, lost his position as a timber crew supervisor in April. The official reason cited his age and concerns about whether he could continue handling the physical demands of the job. Samuel was 43 years old and had worked the same position successfully for 7 years. 3 younger men with less experience remained in supervisory roles. The store credit situation functioned even more efficiently as a control mechanism. Families throughout Pike Hollow depended on the ability to purchase supplies on credit and settle their accounts after selling timber or crops. Losing credit access meant either paying cash, which most families didn't have, or traveling to the county seat for supplies, adding significant time and expense to basic household needs. The Kincaid family's credit termination in March set the precedent. Other families who'd supported Clara received similar notices over the following weeks. The store manager explained each decision as based on outstanding debt levels or concerns about repayment ability, never mentioning the controversy. However, families known to oppose Clara or remain neutral saw their credit limits maintained or increased, even in cases where their debt levels exceeded those whose credit was cut. By May, the economic pressure had achieved its purpose. Several families who'd initially defended Clara stopped mentioning her name in public conversation. They didn't formally recant their support, but their silence functioned as practical retreat. Continuing to defend her meant choosing principle over their children's ability to eat. And most people couldn't afford that choice, regardless of what they believed about Clara's honesty. The legal system offered no recourse for this type of economic retaliation. Employers in 1908 had nearly unlimited discretion to hire and fire workers for any reason or no reason. Store owners could extend or deny credit based on whatever criteria they chose. No laws prevented using economic power to punish people for their social or political positions. The lack of legal protection meant that economic power could accomplish what direct violence or legal action couldn't, forcing compliance through mechanisms that appeared entirely legitimate. The Tenbrook strategy was more sophisticated than simple retaliation. They created conditions where supporting Clara became economically irrational while maintaining plausible deniability about their motivations. This approach was more effective than filing a defamation lawsuit, which would have required engaging with Clara's evidence in a public forum where medical testimony and witness statements might have supported her claims. By refusing to engage legally, the Tenbrooks kept control of the narrative entirely in the social and economic realm, where they held overwhelming advantage. Clara's evidence couldn't be formally examined or verified. Ruth couldn't testify in court. The baby's appearance couldn't be evaluated by impartial medical experts. The entire situation remained locked in the realm of community gossip and social positioning rather than legal fact-finding. The strategy also protected the family from future accountability. Without a legal proceeding, no official record existed of the accusation or the evidence supporting it. Decades later, researchers would find only fragmentary references in private letters and diary entries, nothing substantial enough to reconstruct what actually happened. The absence of documentation allowed the family to control how the story was remembered, or whether it was remembered at all. Ruth and her child remained at Clara's cabin through February and March, though their presence became increasingly precarious as Clara's economic situation deteriorated. The mothers who would normally have called on Clara for deliveries were choosing other midwives or traveling to doctors, not because they questioned her medical competence, but because associating with her carried social costs they couldn't afford. In April, Ruth and the baby disappeared from the historical record entirely. No census entry, no birth certificate filed with the county, no baptism record at any church in the region. Whether Ruth left voluntarily, was persuaded to leave, or met some other fate cannot be determined from surviving documents. The timing of her disappearance, occurring exactly as economic pressure on Clara's supporters reached its peak, suggests the two events were connected. The Tenbrook family's silence remained absolute through the entire sequence of events. They never acknowledged Ruth's existence, never addressed Clara's accusation, never explained why families supporting the midwife faced economic consequences. Their refusal to engage left the community suspended in permanent uncertainty, unable to prove or disprove claims that everyone knew about, but no one could officially verify. Ruth and her child were last documented in Pike Hollow in late March of 1908, and then they simply ceased to exist in any official capacity. The final confirmed sighting comes from Margaret Kincaid's diary entry dated March 27th, where she mentions bringing food to Clara's cabin and seeing Ruth nursing the baby. The entry notes that Ruth looked healthier than she had immediately after the birth, but remained withdrawn and fearful. Margaret wrote that Ruth barely spoke during the visit and kept watching the trail as though expecting someone to arrive. After that date, Ruth disappears completely from the historical record. No death certificate was filed for her or the child in Breathitt County or any surrounding county. No marriage license appears bearing her name or any variations researchers have tested. No census entry from 1910 lists anyone matching her description or the child's age. No church baptism records mention the baby. No grave marker in any cemetery in eastern Kentucky bears her name or lists an unmarked burial around that time frame. The absence is so complete that it suggests deliberate erasure, rather than simple gaps in record-keeping. Even in remote mountain regions where documentation was inconsistent, people left some trace of their existence. Women married and appeared in marriage records. Children were baptized and appeared in church registers. Deaths were recorded, if only in family Bibles or cemetery records. Ruth and her child left nothing, which required either extraordinary effort to avoid documentation or removal from circumstances where documentation occurred. Several explanations fit the evidence, each disturbing in different ways. The first possibility is that Ruth left the region voluntarily, traveling far enough that her path couldn't be traced through surviving records. Women in desperate circumstances sometimes fled to cities where they could disappear into anonymity, finding work under assumed names and creating new identities completely separate from their pasts. If Ruth chose this path, she might have succeeded in escaping the situation that had brought her to Clara's cabin in the first place. Historical records from Appalachian migration patterns show that young women did occasionally leave mountain communities for industrial cities like Cincinnati, Louisville, or Pittsburgh. These cities offered factory work and domestic service positions that asked few questions about applicants' backgrounds. A young mother with an infant would face challenges finding such work, but charitable organizations and church groups sometimes provided temporary housing and assistance. Ruth could have reached one of these support networks and built a new life where her past remained unknown. The second possibility is that Ruth was persuaded or coerced to leave. The timing of her disappearance, occurring exactly as economic pressure on Clara and her supporters reached its peak, suggests coordination rather than coincidence. Someone with resources could have arranged for Ruth to be relocated, somewhere distant with financial support, contingent on her permanent silence about the child's paternity. This approach would have solved multiple problems simultaneously, removing the physical evidence of the accusation while avoiding the complications that more direct solutions would create. Arrangements of this type occurred with some frequency in cases involving wealthy families and illegitimate children. A young mother might be given money, passage to a distant location, and instructions to never return or contact anyone from her previous life. The agreement would be informal, backed by the implicit threat that more harmful options existed if she refused. Historical records contain occasional references to such arrangements, though their informal nature meant they rarely appeared in official documents. The third possibility is darker and explains why Ruth's disappearance has troubled researchers for decades. Women and children in vulnerable positions sometimes vanished in ways that suggested they hadn't left voluntarily or survived the experience. Pike Hollow's geographic isolation, limited law enforcement presence, and the Tenbrook family's economic dominance created conditions where permanent disappearance could occur without investigation. The Kentucky mountains contained numerous locations where remains could be hidden effectively. Abandoned mine shafts, dense forest areas, and the region's extensive cave systems offered concealment that would prevent discovery even with deliberate searching. Spring flooding could remove evidence. Wild animals could scatter remains beyond recognition. A person who disappeared in April might never be found, regardless of how extensively people looked. However, attributing Ruth's disappearance to violence requires assuming facts not supported by evidence. No witnesses reported seeing anything suspicious. No physical evidence of harm was ever discovered. No deathbed confessions or family secrets revealed what happened. The best absence of information supports speculation, but doesn't confirm any particular conclusion. What remains indisputable is that Ruth and her child existed in documented form until late March, and then stopped existing in any traceable way. This pattern of complete erasure from official records occurred rarely enough that its appearance in this case seems significant. Most people who left communities or died young still appeared somewhere in the historical record, even if only in fragmentary form. Ruth's complete absence suggests active effort to ensure she couldn't be traced. The disappearance served multiple purposes regardless of how it occurred. It removed the most important witness to whatever had happened before the child's birth. It eliminated the physical evidence in the form of the baby, whose appearance Clara had claimed proved her accusation. It demonstrated to anyone considering supporting Clara that people connected to the controversy could vanish without consequence or investigation. Clara never spoke publicly about what happened to Ruth after March. Whether she knew Ruth's fate and chose silence, or whether Ruth vanished without Clara's knowledge, cannot be determined from surviving sources. The midwife's later isolation and apparent trauma suggest the disappearance affected her deeply, but her specific knowledge about it remains unknown. The pattern of Ruth's erasure from records followed similar cases documented in Appalachian history, where vulnerable people simply stopped existing in any official capacity. These disappearances occurred frequently enough that historians recognize them as a distinct phenomenon, though individual cases rarely received investigation or resolution. The combination of geographic isolation, limited law enforcement, economic power imbalances, and social stigma created conditions where certain people could vanish without generating questions that authorities felt obligated to answer. Ruth's absence from history became its own form of evidence. The question wasn't just what happened to her, but why ensuring she left no trace mattered enough to whoever controlled her fate that they invested significant effort in achieving complete erasure. By the summer of 1909, Clara Hewitt's name appeared in birth records less frequently than midwives who'd been practicing for only 2 years. The decline was measurable and deliberate. Breathitt County birth records show Clara attended 21 deliveries in 1906, 18 in 1907, and only 4 in 1909. By 1910, her name appeared on just 1 birth certificate, and after that year, she vanished from official medical documentation entirely. The drop couldn't be explained by competition from other midwives or increased access to doctors. The total number of births in her traditional service area remained consistent. Women were simply choosing anyone except Clara. The families who stopped calling her weren't just those connected to the Tenbrook economic network. Even people who'd initially supported her accusation eventually found reasons to seek other help when their daughters or wives went into labor. The explanations varied, but carried the same underlying message. They'd heard Clara had become unreliable. They worried she might be too old to handle complicated deliveries. They felt more comfortable with a midwife who lived closer to the main road. None of these reasons matched Clara's actual circumstances. She was 52 years old in 1909, younger than several midwives, who continued practicing successfully. Her cabin's location hadn't changed. Her medical competence hadn't declined. What had changed was that calling Clara for a delivery meant making a social statement that most families couldn't afford to make. Letters from this period reveal the social cost of maintaining any association with her. A woman named Sarah Gabbard wrote to her cousin in June of 1909, describing her difficult choice when she went into labor with her third child. She'd used Clara for her previous 2 deliveries and trusted her completely, but her husband worked for the Tenbrook lumber operation and couldn't risk being identified as a Clara supporter. Sarah ended up traveling to the county seat for a doctor, a dangerous 8-hour journey while in active labor, rather than call the midwife who lived 3 miles away. The letter captures the impossible calculation families faced. Sarah's baby could have died during that journey. She nearly hemorrhaged in a wagon on mountain roads. The doctor in town had never seen her before and knew nothing about her medical history. Yet all of that risk seemed preferable to the certainty of what would happen if her family was seen bringing Clara to their home. Clara's isolation extended beyond her professional work. Margaret Kincaid's diary entries from 1909 track the progressive severing of Clara's social connections. In April, Margaret mentions that Clara stopped attending church entirely, not just the divided congregation in Pike Hollow, but any service in the region. In June, Margaret notes that she visited Clara and found the cabin in poor condition, with repairs neglected and the garden unplanted. The diary entry from August describes Clara as altered beyond recognition, speaking in fragments and barely acknowledging my presence. The most disturbing entry comes from October of 1909. Margaret writes that Clara told her she'd spoken all her words at once and had none left now. When Margaret pressed for details about Ruth or what had happened after March, Clara refused to engage, staring out the window and eventually asking Margaret to leave. The diary entry concludes with Margaret's observation that Clara had become silent and strange, like something had broken inside her that used to hold everything together. Other sources from this period paint a consistent picture of deterioration. A traveling preacher who visited Pike Hollow in the spring of 1910 mentioned Clara in his journal, noting that locals warned him to avoid her cabin because she'd gone peculiar and wasn't fit for company. He didn't elaborate on what peculiar meant, but the warning itself indicated how completely Clara's social standing had collapsed. The county tax records show Clara continued owning her property through 1912, paying taxes irregularly and falling behind by several years. No eviction proceedings were filed, possibly because no one wanted to deal with the property, or because even her opponents felt some hesitation about forcing an elderly woman into homelessness. The records indicate someone paid her back taxes in 1914, though the payer's identity wasn't recorded. Store ledgers from the period show Clara purchasing minimal supplies on an increasingly irregular basis. Between April of 1909 and her final recorded purchase in February of 1912, she bought only basic staples in small quantities. The pattern suggested she was surviving rather than living, subsisting on the minimum necessary to avoid starvation. Neighbors who'd once sought her medical expertise now avoided contact entirely. The social death preceded any physical death by years, creating a situation where Clara existed in geographic proximity to the community, but complete social isolation from it. She'd become invisible while remaining physically present, a ghost haunting her own life. The psychological impact of this isolation can only be inferred from second-hand observations. Clara had spent 23 years as a central figure in Pike Hollow's social structure, trusted with the community's most intimate secrets and essential life events. Her identity had been built entirely around that role and the respect it commanded. When that role was stripped away, the foundation of her self-understanding collapsed. Modern psychological research on social isolation and identity loss suggests that Clara's deterioration followed a predictable pattern. People whose core identity depends on professional role and community standing often experience severe psychological crisis when those elements are removed suddenly. The trauma compounds when the loss results from punishment for actions the person believed were morally necessary. Clara hadn't just lost her livelihood. She'd lost her purpose, her social connections, her sense of meaning, and her place in the only community she'd ever known. The punishment for speaking what she believed was truth had been total erasure from the social fabric that had defined her entire adult life. By 1912, Clara Hewitt no longer appeared in any community records. Whether she'd died, left the region, or simply withdrawn so completely that no one bothered documenting her existence couldn't be determined from surviving sources. The woman who'd brought nearly 100 children into the world had herself ceased to exist in any official sense, erased as completely as Ruth had been 4 years earlier. The Breathitt County Courthouse fire of 1937 destroyed half the building, but the gaps in documentation from Clara's era existed decades before any flames touched the archives. Historical researchers first noticed the pattern in the 1970s, when academics began systematically studying Appalachian social history. Records from Pike Hollow showed unusual damage clustering around specific time frames, particularly the years 1908 through 1910. The gaps weren't random. They appeared in multiple independent record systems simultaneously, suggesting either coordinated destruction or a remarkable coincidence of natural deterioration. The courthouse ledgers for birth records contain visible evidence of interference. Pages covering February through May of 1908 show water damage so severe that many entries are completely illegible. However, pages immediately before and after this period remain in relatively good condition. The water damage affects only the specific months when Ruth's child would have been registered if a birth certificate had been filed. County clerks maintained these ledgers in the same storage location throughout the building's history until the 1937 fire. If water damage occurred from roof leaks or flooding, it should have affected continuous sections of the ledger rather than isolated pages. The selective nature of the damage raised questions about whether natural causes could explain the pattern. Property deed records from the same period show similar issues. Several deeds involving land transfers in Pike Hollow during 1908 have pages missing entirely, leaving gaps in the chain of title that complicated legal disputes for decades afterward. The missing pages weren't consecutive. They appeared scattered through the volume in a way that affected specific transactions while leaving others intact. One particularly suspicious gap involves a property transfer recorded in April of 1908. The index lists the transaction between parties whose names are partially legible, but the actual deed page was removed so cleanly that the binding shows clear knife marks. Whoever removed the page did so deliberately and with tools, not through accidental tearing or natural deterioration. Family Bibles from Pike Hollow families show the same clustering of damage. These Bibles served as primary genealogical records in communities where official documentation was inconsistent. Families recorded births, marriages, and deaths in the front pages, creating permanent family histories that often provided more accurate information than courthouse records. At least 7 family Bibles from Pike Hollow families, active during Clara's era, have pages torn out from the section covering 1908 through 1910. The Drummond Family Bible, now housed in the Kentucky Historical Society, shows clear evidence of page removal. The torn edges indicate the pages were ripped out forcefully, rather than falling out from age or handling. Whatever information those pages contained was considered important enough to physically destroy. The Gabbard Family Bible contains an even more telling detail. Someone attempted to erase an entry dated January of 1908 before finally tearing the entire page out. The erased text left impressions on the underlying page that are partially legible under certain lighting conditions. Researchers using modern imaging techniques have recovered fragments suggesting the entry referenced a birth, but the complete text remains unreadable. Newspaper archives from the Breathitt County Herald for 1908 show gaps that can't be explained by normal deterioration. The Kentucky State Historical Society maintains the most complete collection of these newspapers on microfilm. But even their archives are missing every edition published between January 15th and March 10th of that year. The gap covers exactly the period when Clara made her accusation and when community response would have been most intense. Individual families sometimes kept newspaper clippings, and a few editions from this missing period survive in private collections. However, none of these surviving copies contain any mention of Clara, Ruth, or the Tenbrook controversy. Either those specific stories were removed from the copies that survived, or the Herald chose not to publish anything about the situation during the period when it would have been most newsworthy. The pattern extended to church records as well. Oak Grove Baptist's session, minutes from 1908, contain visible gaps where pages were removed. The minutes jump from early February directly to late April, missing exactly the period when the congregation was splitting over Clara's accusation. Reverend Thomas Lyle's diary provides some information about what happened during those months, but official church documentation of the controversy was removed so thoroughly that reconstructing events requires piecing together fragmentary sources. 2 explanations for these gaps seem most plausible. The first is deliberate destruction by people who wanted to erase evidence of the controversy. This theory fits the pattern of damage affecting multiple independent record systems simultaneously and targeting specific time frames relevant to Clara's case. Someone with access to courthouse records, family Bibles, newspaper archives, and church documents could have systematically removed or damaged materials that documented the accusation and its aftermath. The second explanation is less sinister but equally possible. These records are more than a century old and have survived fires, floods, improper storage, and decades of handling. Natural deterioration could have affected materials from the same period across different collections, simply because they shared the same age and environmental challenges. Water damage clusters where it enters buildings. Pages tear out from heavily used sections of Bibles. Newspaper collections develop gaps when individual issues were borrowed and never returned. However, natural deterioration typically creates random patterns rather than targeting specific relevant timeframes. The fact that the gaps cluster so precisely around Clara's accusation and its immediate aftermath suggests intentionality rather than chance. Random damage would affect records from 1907 and 1911 with similar frequency. But those years remain relatively well documented, while 1908 through 1910 show systematic gaps. Modern archival science has developed techniques for detecting deliberate versus accidental damage to historical documents. Analysis of the Breathitt County records has revealed mixed results. Some damage clearly resulted from environmental factors like water infiltration and insect activity. Other damage shows characteristics consistent with intentional removal, including clean cuts, strategic targeting of specific entries, and patterns that transcend what natural causes would produce. The question remains whether someone invested significant effort in erasing Clara's story from the historical record, or whether the combination of fire, flood, age, and neglect happened to destroy exactly the documents that would prove what actually occurred. Either possibility fits the available evidence, and researchers cannot definitively determine which explanation is correct. What's indisputable is that reconstructing Clara's case requires working from fragments and second-hand accounts rather than comprehensive documentation. The absence of evidence forces reliance on interpretation and inference rather than clear factual record. Whether that absence resulted from deliberate suppression or unfortunate coincidence achieved the same result, making verification of Clara's claims impossible. Clara Hewitt's death certificate doesn't exist in Breathitt County or anywhere else researchers have searched, which means her final fate remains as uncertain as the truth she claimed to speak. The last documented reference to Clara alive appears in a property tax notice from 1912, suggesting she still owned her cabin at that time. After that year, she vanishes from every record system as completely as Ruth had 4 years earlier. No death certificate was filed. No burial record exists in any cemetery. No probate documents show what happened to her property. The woman who'd kept meticulous records of other people's births left no trace of her own death. Family stories from Pike Hollow offer contradictory accounts of what happened to her. Some descendants claim Clara left the region entirely, traveling west to start over where no one knew her history. Others insist she died alone in her cabin, sometime around 1913 or 1914, with her body discovered weeks or months later by someone who chose not to report it officially. A third version suggests she simply walked into the mountains one day and never returned, either by choice or because age and isolation had affected her mental state beyond recovery. None of these stories can be verified. They exist as oral tradition passed through families, each version reflecting what the storytellers wanted to believe about Clara's end. The lack of documentation means all possibilities remain equally plausible and equally unprovable. The Tenbrook family's trajectory is better documented, but ultimately just as mysterious. Census records show the family maintained their presence in Breathitt County through the 1920s. Virgil Tenbrook died in 1926, his death certificate listing heart failure as the cause. His obituary in the county newspaper described him as a prominent businessman and landowner, making no mention of controversy or scandal. The family's economic holdings passed to his children, who continued operating the lumber business through the 1930s. By 1940, the Tenbrook name had disappeared from Breathitt County records entirely. The property was sold to outside investors. The remaining family members relocated to other states, according to family genealogy records maintained by distant relatives. Whether they left voluntarily or were forced out by changing economic conditions or social pressure cannot be determined from available sources. The timing of the family's departure, occurring roughly 3 decades after Clara's accusation, might be coincidental or might reflect long-term consequences that took years to fully manifest. Communities remember scandals across generations, and whispered stories about the Tenbrooks could have created conditions that made remaining in the region increasingly difficult, even decades later. What survived Clara's case wasn't documentation or verified facts, but warnings passed between grandmothers to granddaughters. These warnings took various forms, depending on which side of the original divide the family had fallen. Some versions emphasized the danger of speaking too freely about powerful people. Others stressed the importance of protecting women and speaking truth regardless of consequences. The contradictory lessons reflected the community's unresolved conflict about whether Clara had been righteous or reckless. Modern researchers first encountered the Clara Hewitt case in the 1970s when collecting oral histories from elderly Appalachian residents. Multiple people independently mentioned the midwife, who'd named a prominent man as father to an illegitimate child and paid a terrible price for speaking. The details varied wildly between accounts. Some remembered Clara as a hero who'd tried to protect a young victim. Others recalled her as a troublemaker who'd violated sacred trust. A few insisted the entire story was exaggerated folklore with minimal basis in fact. The academic investigation that followed revealed the fragmentary documentary evidence outlined in previous chapters. Researchers found enough corroboration to confirm Clara existed, practiced midwifery in Pike Hollow, and became involved in a controversy in 1908 that destroyed her career and social standing. Beyond those basic facts, nearly everything remains disputed or unknown. The case raises questions that extend far beyond one midwife's accusation. It illuminates how power operated in isolated communities where formal legal systems had minimal presence. It demonstrates how economic control could enforce silence more effectively than legal threats. It shows how the absence of documentation could protect wrongdoers while erasing victims from history. Most fundamentally, Clara's story forces consideration of what truth means when verification becomes impossible. She claimed to have witnessed evidence of assault. She identified a specific perpetrator. She faced total destruction of her life as punishment for speaking. None of these facts prove her accusation was accurate, but they don't prove it was false either. The mountains closed ranks to ensure no one could ever verify Clara's claim. Whether that collective silence protected an innocent man from false accusation or protected a guilty man from accountability depends entirely on which version of events you choose to believe. The evidence supports both interpretations equally, which might have been the point all along. Perhaps the real question isn't whether Clara told the truth. Perhaps it's why a community invested so much effort in making the truth unknowable. Why systematic destruction or neglect of records? Why complete erasure of witnesses? Why generational silence passed down as wisdom rather than shame? The answer reveals something uncomfortable about how societies handle accusations against the powerful. When verification would threaten existing power structures, communities often choose collective amnesia over accountability. The absence of evidence becomes evidence of a different kind, proving not what happened, but what communities prioritize when truth threatens stability. Clara Hewitt spoke a name when silence was required. Whether she was right or wrong matters less than the fact that asking the question became impossible. The mountains kept her secret by forgetting she'd ever had one to tell. And in the space where truth should have been, only silence remained. If this story disturbed you, if it made you think about the price of speaking truth in places where silence is survival, then this channel is doing exactly what it's meant to do. We dig up the cases that history tried to bury, the stories that communities wanted forgotten, the questions that powerful people hoped would never be asked. Hit that like button if you believe some silences deserve to be broken. Subscribe, because there are hundreds more cases like Clara's waiting to be told, and we're going to tell every single one of them. The truth doesn't disappear just because records do. It waits in fragments and whispers until someone bothers to listen. We're listening. Join us.